It was not a whisper. It was not covered by music or politely hidden behind a hand. Ted stood in the front pew of Main Post Chapel at Fort Liberty at my own wedding and said it loud enough for the stained glass to catch the words and throw them back at me. It is a costume. His voice carried through the chapel like a slap. A few heads turned, a couple of cousins laughed into their palms. One of my aunts actually lifted her phone pretending to fix her hair, but her camera was angled straight at me. Halloween came early, she whispered to the woman beside her. Colin smirked, full of the same confidence that had been handed to him since childhood. Be normal for once. I had not even taken 10 steps into the aisle. I had not said a word. And already the people who were supposed to love me were trying to make a spectacle of me. My mother grabbed my wrist so hard I could feel the bones pressed together, change before the photos. Morgan, do not make us look crazy. My chest tightened. The organist missed a note. The air shifted, restless and uncomfortable. I stood there in my Army service uniform ribbons and citations that had taken years of fear and command to earn, and I felt smaller than I had in a long time. But I held myself still. I did not blink, did not answer, did not bow. Ted was just getting started. He pulled out his phone like he was about to read scripture, scrolling until his eyes lit with a cruel little triumph. "Remember this," he said. And he started reading an old message from the family group chat, twisting every sentence. "Do not embarrass us in that getup. Come dressed like a real bride." But he changed the tone, changed the phrasing, made it sound like I had begged him, like I had apologized. People leaned in to hear better. Someone snorted. Someone whispered, "She must know, it looks stupid. Look how nervous she is." I was not nervous. I was furious. But fury is a strange thing. It can look a lot like silence. Ted lifted the phone higher and said, "Everyone knows you only wear that thing to feel important. You are not overseas. This is not a drill. Try being a wife instead of a pretend hero." That hit harder than anything else. Not because it was true, but because he said it while someone was recording. I caught the reflection of a phone in the corner of my eye, the screen-up camera pointed at me, waiting for a breakdown. They wanted a show. They wanted me to crumble. They wanted proof that their judgment still ruled my life. My stomach twisted, but I kept my eyes forward. I touched the corner of the DA 638 citation in my pocket. That paper was earned in a night that still woke me up with cold sweat. It deserved respect. I deserved respect. But not from these people, not on this day. Colin stepped up beside Ted and pretended to soothe him loud enough for everyone to hear. "She is sensitive. Do not make her cry before the vows." Someone giggled. The chapel felt colder than any desert night I had ever stood through. Ted leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make me the only target. This wedding was supposed to be family, not a parade. "Look at you. You cannot even take a joke." I wanted to speak, but before I could, he added the line that made something inside me snap without moving a muscle. Even soldiers know when to take orders, and you never could. The cruelty was not loud. It did not need to be. It was clean, sharp, practiced. Years of being told I was wrong. Strange, stubborn, unfeminine, too hard, too military, too much. Years of coming home from deployment to hear more about Colin's job interviews than the names of soldiers I lost. Years of sitting at holiday tables where my uniform was treated like a costume, a phase something I would outgrow if they shamed me long enough. But this time they were laughing in a chapel during my wedding, while wearing jewelry bought with my mother's money, while waiting to eat food from a reception they did not help pay for. Something cold settled into my chest. I did not raise my voice. I did not move. I looked straight ahead. That was when I heard them. Leather soles on stone outside the doors, heavy, measured, not rushed, the kind of walking done by people who do not enter a room. They claim it. Chaplain Carter glanced toward the side aisle and gave the smallest nod to First Sergeant Kim. My aunts stopped whispering. Colin's smile fell just a little. Ted looked over his shoulder, confused, already losing control of a moment he thought he owned. The doors trembled under pressure from hands waiting to push them open. The room held its breath. All those phones, all those eyes, all that shame they were so sure I would choke on. None of them knew the truth walking toward them. None of them knew the wave that was about to hit. I did not need to defend myself. I did not need to explain a single ribbon. The answer was coming. And Ted Whitaker, the man who thought my uniform was a costume, was about to learn exactly who I was and what it meant when soldiers walked in formation. Carolina Diner smelled like butter and coffee and the kind of fried onions that cling to a jacket long after you leave the bell. Over the door chimed as we walked in. Ted stepped ahead like a man escorting a lesser party. Elaine followed with that soft, careful smile that says, "She will keep the peace even if it costs someone else." Colin checked his reflection in the window and smoothed his hair with 2 fingers. I slid into the booth opposite them and pressed the crease of my sleeve flat. My uniform jacket stayed folded in my bag because tonight was supposed to be family, not duty. I told myself that over and over while the laminated menus stuck slightly to my palms. The waitress set down waters and a coffee for Ted. Before he asked, "He is a regular here, and he likes people to know that I ordered grilled chicken and green beans." Elaine wanted a spinach salad. Colin wanted the tallest burger on the board. Ted asked for meatloaf, extra brown, and then he cleared his throat like a gavel. He did not offer small talk or ask about my drive from Post. He did not ask about Ryan or the timeline or the chapel. He simply said that 32 is an age when normal women have children and that normal brides wear silk. He said this like he was reading a temperature. Elaine patted his wrist and told me not to mind him. Colin leaned forward with the glow of a man ready to be celebrated and announced that a consulting firm in Raleigh had made him an offer with a signing bonus. The table brightened as if the overhead bulbs had been turned up. Elaine gasped with delight and asked about start date and benefits. Ted lifted his coffee and toasted to leadership. I added congratulations in a steady voice and asked about commute and parking. Colin launched into a story about a recruiter who said his potential is obvious. The waitress came back and topped off Ted's cup, while Elaine asked Colin to share the news in the family chat because everyone should be proud. I nodded because pride is a generous thing and it costs nothing. Then I mentioned in a small practical tone that my last deployment paperwork finally cleared and a citation had been added to the file. I did not stay on the subject. I placed it next to theirs, with care. Ted cut a slice of meatloaf and set another pin and moved on. Elaine asked if I had picked a florist. She did not look at me. When she asked, she looked at Colin as if his reaction would decide whether my answers mattered. I felt the familiar press at the base of my throat and let it pass. I have learned to swallow certain things whole. The check for the venue deposit was due this week, and I said I would take care of it. Ted shook his head slowly and smiled like a man about to be generous. He said, "We will handle the finances if you promise to keep the wedding tasteful." He touched the word tasteful the way a person touches a bruise to see if it still hurts. I asked what tasteful meant to him, and he said it meant a white gown rather than stiff fabric and pins. It meant no honor guard, because our relatives from Charlotte do not understand military theater. It meant being a normal bride. For one day, the word normal landed like a coin on a glass table round and ringing. Colin added that the optics of a military theme can be confusing for civilians and suggested I save the formation for a promotion ceremony. Elaine nodded and said, "We want ease, not drama." The waitress placed our plates, and I watched the steam lift from the chicken like a quiet signal. I asked Ted if his offer to handle the costs meant he was prepared to cover the venue balance, the photographer, the florist, transportation for out-of-town guests, if needed. Ted said all of it with a satisfied face. He said this is the right way, and that I should think of the family. I cut my chicken and said, I am thinking of the family, which is why I want the truth in the room. Colin laughed and said, "The truth is that lace photographs better than brass." Elaine murmured, "Be normal and we will all be happy." The table across the aisle glanced over when he said, "Be normal." People always look up when the word normal is used like a fence. I reached down to my bag and felt the stiff edge of a folded contract and the smooth plastic of a card. I thought about the way humiliation grows in the dark, and I decided to bring a little light. I told Elaine thank you for offering, and I told Ted that I appreciate the concern, and then I said that my uniform is not a theme, and that respect is not a prop. I said the wedding will be simple and orderly, and that the chaplain has the run of show. Ted waved a fork as if to bat my words aside. He said, I can promise to pay only if you promise to drop the military parts. He said our guests should not have to play along with your career. The words career and play along sat badly together. I took a breath and counted to 4. The way I learned to do in a cramped aircraft seat, I said, I will not accept conditions on my life. I reached for the black vinyl check folder the waitress had left near Colin's elbow. Colin slid it toward me as if it had always been mine. I opened it and set my card inside. I told the waitress, we will settle. Now. Ted laughed softly and said, of course you will. You are good at taking care of things. He meant that I am good at cleaning up after them. The waitress returned. I signed. I wrote the tip. I asked for a printed receipt. When she brought it, I folded it and placed it with the contract. Elaine blinked in surprise and asked why so formal. I said so. The paperwork stays clean. Ted tried a new angle and said, think about legacy. Think about children looking back at photos. Do you want them to see a drill captain or a bride? I let him finish. Then I told him the children who matter will see commitment and order, and a mother who did not dress her life to please a crowd. His face cooled. He said, then do not expect me to stand up for something that makes us look strange, he said. Relatives talk and reputations travel. Colin nodded and spoke about clients and perception and the burden of family image. That word burden stepped on my last thin nerve, but I did not show it. I asked Elaine about seating assignments and food allergies, and she brightened. She said she could take the logistics if I loosened the aesthetic. I told her I would keep the logistics with me, so no one is blamed when a detail goes wrong. I said it gently and moved my water glass 2 inches to the right. The bell over the door chimed again, and a pair of soldiers in dusty boots came in laughing. The sound loosened something in my spine. Ted saw where my eyes had gone and rolled as he said, you cannot turn every room into a base. I said, I am not turning any room into anything. I'm deciding who I am. In it. Then Elaine's phone buzzed, and she read a message with a small intake of breath. She turned the screen, and I saw a text from Ted to her that had been forwarded by a cousin. It was the message Be Normal sent last month, with a note about making sure the uniform does not ruin the photos. My jaw stayed still while my heart stepped down. A stare betrayal does not need volume to make itself known. It only needs timing. I looked at Ted, and he stared back. Without shame, he said context matters and that people misread texts. I said printed agreements do not misread themselves. He knitted his brows at the word printed. I told him I had moved the vendor contracts into my name this afternoon and had transferred the deposit from my account. I said the venue coordinator would now communicate directly with me. Colin whistled like a referee and said someone is on a mission. Elaine asked if that is necessary. I said it prevents confusion. The waitress returned to ask about dessert. Ted said none for us and handed her the menus like a man closing a file. I stood and thanked her by name and asked for one more copy of the receipt. She printed it, and I slid it into the pocket with the contract. It made a neat, soft sound, the kind a clean choice makes. Ted told me not to dramatize a simple request and reminded me that the family image should not be harmed by military theater. I said quietly, that dignity is not theater, and that nothing about my life is a costume. I left cash for the tip on the edge of the table. I told Elaine I would call her tomorrow with the vendor list so she could rest. She looked relieved, and then worried, and then relieved again. Colin tapped his burger wrapper into a tighter shape and said, "This is getting intense." I smiled a little. Intensity is a word people use when a woman refuses to be edited. We stepped out into the cooling October air. The parking lot smelled like rain and gasoline. The bell chimed behind us. Ted said, "Think about what I offered before you make a mistake." I said I already did and I already decided. He said the family will talk. I said they always do. I opened my bag and slipped the contract deeper so it would not bend. A quiet plan clicked into place. Small and exact, a plan built on receipts and respect. I did not need to raise my voice. I only needed to keep walking. The rest would come on its own feet. The rest would answer for me. And when it did, no one at that table would confuse normal with right again. Haymount's event room smelled of polished wood and vanilla candles, the kind of space meant for soft laughter and warm, clinking glasses, the kind of place where families pretend everything is gentle, the kind of place where I kept telling myself nothing could go wrong because rehearsal dinners are supposed to be easy. But the moment we walked in, I felt the shift small at first, like a draft under a closed door. Elaine waved at cousins and old friends from Charlotte. Colin shook hands like a politician kissing his own reflection, and Ted moved with the confidence of someone who believed this room belonged to him. The lights on the chandeliers were low and gold, the tables were dressed in white linens with neat folded napkins, and my name was nowhere in sight. On the seating board I scanned once, polite and patient, then again with slower eyes. My name appeared, but not at the front, with family. Not even near the center. It was printed small and placed at the last table by the service door, a chair tucked behind a pillar where I could be hidden from photos. I did not touch the card yet. I just looked at it steady because humiliation has a smell when it is fresh, a mix of perfume and quiet triumph. Elaine bounced her hands together and said, "Look how beautiful the setup is," and how Ted talked to the coordinator to make sure everything looked perfect. I knotted my throat, even my heartbeat steady, but inside I could feel the familiar burn of family betrayal sitting just below the surface. Ted clinked a spoon against his glass. He did it with theatrical timing. The chatter fell away in obedient silence. He smiled like a man stepping on a stage and raised his glass toward me, and in a voice warm enough for strangers but cold enough for me, he said, "Here is to one day seeing her in a real wedding gown instead of all that military stuff." The room laughed, not all at once but in ripples, small, sharp ripples. A couple near the buffet table covered their mouths like school children. A young cousin whispered, "Is she really wearing the uniform tomorrow?" Another voice said, "The military is just a phase. She will grow out of it." I stood still. I smiled the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes, a smile that says, "I am fine," because the alternative would give them too much. Ryan reached for my hand under the table. His thumb pressed steady against my skin. I lifted my glass and thanked everyone for being here. The words sounded calm enough to make the laughter wilt. Ted smiled wider because he thought he had won the first point of the evening. The coordinator walked over to guide us to seats, and Colin puffed his chest and said the seating was rearranged for better photos because the family should shine tonight. He made sure to say family in a way that excluded me. I walked with them, holding my breath behind my ribs. And when we reached the back table and I saw my name again next to a stack of unused chairs, I felt that familiar, cut small and precise, meant to draw blood without leaving a scar. I could have sat, I could have pretended not to see, but a soldier learns that silence is a blade you can use without lifting a hand. So I asked the coordinator in the same tone I use to brief a mission if I could see the original seating list for final confirmation. She blinked twice because most brides do not ask for confirmation, but she nodded and went to fetch her clipboard. Ted leaned over the table and whispered, "Do not make this dramatic. Everyone is watching." I did not answer. The coordinator returned and the clipboard trembled just a little because she already knew something was wrong. My name on the original layout was placed at the center table next to Ryan and the chaplain, exactly where protocol seating would expect a bride to be, but someone had changed it. Physically. Moved the card. Physically erased the symbolism of the seat, physically pushed me out of sight. The coordinator gasped in that way. People gasp when they realize someone has tried to make a fool of another person in public. I tapped the name card gently. lifted it with 2 fingers and said calmly that this belongs at the head table. No higher than Ryan. No lower than anyone else. The coordinator apologized 3 times and fixed the setting immediately. Chairs scraped linens, shifted, and suddenly eyes in the room started to notice something had happened, but Ted's face stayed still, fixed in that smirk of a man convinced he is too clever to be caught. He looked at his glass like it was a reflection of his power. What he did not know was that this was a quiet revenge, the kind that sits quietly in the heart and waits for its time, the kind that makes people underestimate you until the entire room is forced to stand at attention. I sat at the head table, the chair next to Ryan, the centerpiece fragrant with roses and eucalyptus, and the laughter that had filled the room minutes earlier grew brittle. Brittle laughter is easy to break. Easy to silence. The salad course arrived. Forks tapped. A violinist played a soft jazz piece, but behind the music I could hear someone hissing that I must have complained that I could not take a joke, that I always brought military seriousness into everything. The anger in their voices did not sting the way it used to, because now I had something they could not see. The formation was already planned, the chaplain had confirmed the run of show, and the soldiers outside rehearsed with quiet precision. All I had to do was endure. Ted tried another toast, something about how a bride should learn to enjoy the spotlight without being intimidating, a few more weak laughs. But this time I watched several faces stiffen, because humiliation repeated too often turns into something ugly even for spectators. Ryan leaned into my shoulder and asked if I wanted to leave. I said no, because leaving would give them what they came for. Instead, I raised my own glass, and in a clear, even voice, I thanked everyone again for traveling for their time, for their presence. I did not mention the seating. I did not mention the insult. I let the courtesy sit heavy in the room, like a weight across every guilty tongue. I caught the coordinator glancing at me with a small nod of respect. Quiet justice flows like that. Slow at first, and then unstoppable desserts came. Coffee came, conversation started to sound forced. The night began folding in on itself. Ted watched from across the room, waiting for my tears, waiting for my voice to crack, waiting for weakness. But I had spent nights on a tarmac waiting for aircraft that never arrived, and mornings briefing soldiers who needed clarity more than comfort. There was no room left in me for breaking the dinner. Ended goodbyes were awkward. Elaine hugged me with the softness of a woman who knows she stood in the wrong place and did nothing. Colin slapped Ryan's back like a man stamping his mark. Ted shook hands with relatives, but he did not look at me as we left outside. The air smelled like cold pine and warm pavement. Ryan tucked his jacket around my shoulders and said, "You handled that better than anyone in there deserved." I looked back at the glowing windows of Haymount's event room and felt something fierce settle inside me. I did not need to shout. I did not need to argue. I only needed to keep walking forward, because the next time they tried to humiliate me, I would not move my chair, the whole room would. The night after the rehearsal dinner, I stood in my kitchen with the refrigerator humming like a tired engine, and the overhead light casting a pale circle across the counter. The candles and soft music of Haymount felt 1,000 miles away. I set my phone down beside a stack of neatly folded linens and took a breath. The scent of coffee grounds and dish soap clung to the air outside. The street was quiet. A dog barked 2 houses down. The ordinary sounds of a normal neighborhood, a neighborhood where no one knew that inside this kitchen, my family was pulling the strings of my wedding like puppeteers. The first message came from Ted, short and sharp. He said, "Cancel the honor guard, because it will look pretentious." He said the ceremony is for loved ones, not for a base audience. The words tasted bitter, even through a screen before I could respond. Another message from Colin arrived saying, "Do not turn your wedding into a base ceremony." He added a laughing emoji, the kind people use when they want to disguise cruelty as humor. I typed a reply, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. Finally, I wrote the simplest truth. The honor guard is already scheduled and confirmed. He responded with a single line saying the family will look foolish if guests think you cannot separate work from your life. My hands shook once. A tiny tremor then steadied. My phone buzzed again. This time, from Elaine, she said, "Sweetie, do not fight them on every detail, just give a little." So there is peace. She said the relatives from Charlotte are nervous about the uniforms and that I should think of them. I leaned against the counter and stared at the tile floor, the same floor I had scrubbed. After long nights on duty, the same floor where I stood when I learned a soldier under me survived, because I made a call at exactly the right second. The weight of those memories pressed against the quiet humiliation of being told that uniforms would scare distant cousins. I typed back calmly that the honor guard is a respectful part of the ceremony and that nothing about it is inappropriate. Elaine replied again, insisting that I compromise because Ted feels disrespected and Colin is embarrassed. I read the messages twice, then 3 times, conflict. Justice does not require shouting, it requires clarity. I placed the phone down and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Even though it was close to midnight, the smell rose warm and steady. I sat at the small kitchen table and poured a cup. The steam curled like breath in cold air. I opened my laptop and checked the correspondence with the chaplain and the venue. Everything had been approved weeks ago, every detail documented. The honor guard was not decoration. It was tradition. It was precision. It was a silent reminder of sacrifice. The next morning came gray and damp. I woke to more messages. Ted had decided to take matters further. He wrote that he called the venue and told them to ban uniforms for photos so that distant relatives would not feel uncomfortable. He said the coordinator agreed. I almost laughed because this was not a man trying to create harmony. This was a man trying to erase the parts of me he could not control. I put on my jacket and drove to the venue. Rain thinned across the windshield. The highway smelled like wet asphalt and pine. I parked near the side entrance and walked inside. The coordinator looked tense when she saw me. She said Ted had called and suggested restrictions, not mandates. She said she wanted to respect privacy. She said it all in the careful tone of someone trying not to take sides. I smiled gently and handed her a printed memo, a protocol document outlining the ceremony signed by Chaplain Carter, by Honor Guard NCOAC by me. The memo referenced Army Regulation 671, stating that dress uniforms were absolutely authorized for ceremonial occasions and that photography restrictions could not be applied based on personal discomfort. The coordinator's shoulders relaxed. She thanked me. She said she would update her files. I told her there was no need to confront Ted. Just move forward with the plan. Quiet revenge has many shapes, and today it looked like a piece of paper with signatures that shut every door. Ted tried to open. Revenge, emotional, does not always come from fury. Sometimes it comes from grace. I drove home through the dripping streets and parked beneath the oak tree. Ryan was waiting in the living room. He saw my expression and asked if I wanted to talk. I said not yet, not until the storm passed. The phone buzzed again. Ted asked if I had listened to reason and canceled the honor guard. He said a bride should not make her family uncomfortable. I placed the phone face down on the table. A small but final gesture. The afternoon crawled by. I folded table runners, reviewed seating plans, checked vendor confirmations, and every so often my mind drifted to the soldiers who would be standing at attention. In 2 days, it steadied me like a hand at my back. Evening settled in the sky, turned to quiet charcoal. Elaine called her voice soft. She said Ted was only trying to help. She said compromise is love. I told her love without respect is not compromise, it is control. She sighed and asked why I insist on making everything difficult. I looked out the window at the streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. I told her difficulty is pretending nothing is wrong. She grew quiet, then said, "Well, do what you want, but do not blame us if people talk." I ended the call gently. No anger, no raised voices, only a tired kind of clarity. Later, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same spot where the night before had unraveled. I opened my laptop and sent a short message to Chaplain Carter confirming the protocol. He replied within minutes. He wrote, "We proceed as planned. Mom, this is your wedding, not a negotiation." The simplicity of that sentence filled the room like warmth. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rattle of branches against the window. I thought about the soldiers who would stand with perfect posture, eyes forward, hands steady. Not because I demanded loyalty, but because respect is a language spoken without sound. By the time the clock crept past midnight, I realized something had shifted inside me, a steadiness deeper than anger, conflict. Justice takes root when you refuse to bend to those who want to make you smaller. I cleaned the counter, washed the coffee mugs, turned off the lights, and went upstairs. My phone buzzed one more time. A final message from Colin saying, "Mom is crying because you always push back." I sighed and placed the phone on the nightstand without answering. Some people cry when they lose control. Others cry when the mask slips. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while rain whispered against the glass. The world outside felt calm, and in that calm, I understood something important. They could keep trying to reduce me, erase me, fold me into the shape they wanted, but the ceremony was already written. The uniforms were already pressed, and the truth was already walking toward them, one precise step at a time. Morning came with the kind of clean brightness that only military bases seem to hold the air sharp, the sky open and the flag snapping high above battalion headquarters. I drove through the gate with my ID pressed against the window. The guard waved me through with a crisp nod, and for a moment the mess of family chatter and toxic comments faded behind the steady rhythm of duty inside the briefing room. The smell of coffee and printer ink blended with the familiar low murmur of soldiers settling into place chairs, scraped boots, thudded, laptops flicked open. I stood at the front with the O poured on the screen behind me. A dozen faces turned toward me, some younger, some older, all focused, all respectful in that quiet way people reserve for those they trust. I began the briefing with the same calm, exact tone I had used in deployments, outlining objectives, timelines, contingencies, risk mitigation, my voice steady like a metronome. I saw the battalion XO watching with a small half smile. The command sergeant major leaned back with his arms folded, nodding at key points, and when I finished, the room stayed silent for a beat. That kind of silence you earn. Then the XO said, "Mom, your command presence is clean." Every soldier in the room heard the approval. Not loud, not theatrical, just honest. I moved through questions, took input, clarified details, and when the last slide clicked off, the CSM asked if the honor guard for wedding ceremony was finalized. He had heard whispers not from family, but from soldiers who cared. I said yes. Chaplain approved venue, confirmed run of show. Documented, he tapped his knuckles lightly against the table and said, "If you want a formation salute, we will provide it." He said it like a promise, not an offer. The XO added that soldiers volunteer fast when they respect someone. A couple of NCOs murmured, "We got you, Mom." The words warmed something in me that had been cold for days. I thanked them and said I did not want to disrupt schedules or duty rosters. The CSM lifted one eyebrow and said respect is a duty roster of its own. They laughed low, and knowing the briefing ended, laptops closed, boots moved toward the door, and for a moment I breathed easier in this world. I was not asked to be normal in this world. I was not mocked for wearing what I earned. I stayed behind to collect papers and clear the whiteboard. The room emptied except for Lieutenant Harris, who lingered before saying, "Mom, someone sent you a link, but you might not want to open it." I frowned and asked what link. He hesitated, once then handed me his phone. The screen showed Facebook a post from an account with no profile picture, just a generic silhouette. The caption read a wedding or a costume party, soldiers pretending to be brides, now awkward laugh emoji. The comments were worse. Not many, but enough a thread of mockery about women who join the military to feel important. The kind of cheap cruelty that grows faster online than in real life. But what made my stomach turn was the phrasing I had seen. That phrasing before, almost word for word. The message Ted sent. The message. He twisted in the chapel. Someone had screenshotted the rehearsal dinner seating chart and posted it without names, but everyone who knew me could recognize the venue, the decorations, the style. I could feel my pulse thickening in my throat. I handed the phone back and said, "Thank you." Harris shook his head and said, "Some people talk louder when they are scared." The XO returned, saw my face, and asked quietly, "You good mom?" I nodded because I was not fragile, only tired of being the subject of someone else's disrespect, tired of family betrayal turned into comedy. For strangers to consume, the XO said, "We can handle this quietly." I told him no need, because sometimes the best revenge stories do not require confrontation. They require endurance. He nodded once. Like a man who understood the quiet kind of war, I left Battalion HQ and drove to Rude Awakening, the little coffee shop 2 blocks from the parade field, where soldiers and retirees sat side by side nursing mugs and arguments about football teams. The barista saw my ID badge and greeted me by name. I ordered black coffee and found a seat near the window. Raindrops tapped the glass in slow, patient rhythms. My phone buzzed on the table. I ignored it, but then it buzzed again and again. Finally, I picked it up and saw a string of messages from soldiers, from lieutenants I had mentored, from NCOs, who had served with me in the field. From one private I had counseled through a panic attack during a night exercise. Every message said, "We saw it. Do not worry. We stand with you." One message from a platoon sergeant said, "Mom, do you want a formation? We will show up in dress blues." If needed, the weight of that loyalty pressed against every broken place inside me. I replied with gratitude. Told them no need, we would keep things professional, but they answered the same way with respect, not pity. I sipped my coffee and watched the rain. The phone buzzed again, this time from Captain Ruiz. He wrote, "Formation is ready. If you give the word, all voluntary, they want to salute." I put the phone down and closed my eyes because revenge. Emotional is not always loud. It can be a single quiet moment where dignity returns and sits down beside you. I opened my eyes when the barista called my name. She placed a blueberry muffin next to the coffee and whispered, "It is on the house. Congratulations on your wedding." It was such a small kindness, but it hit harder than any insult my family had thrown, because it came from respect, not blood. When I left the shop, the sidewalk glistened with rain and streetlights reflected like coins. I checked my phone one more time. There was a new message in the family chat. Someone had shared the anonymous Facebook post and asked if it was funny or cruel. Ted replied lightheartedly, saying, "People are too sensitive these days," the same words he used when he belittled me at dinner tables. I did not respond. Silence can be sharper than anger. Silence makes people wonder what comes next. I drove home and hung my uniform jacket on the back of a chair, every ribbon neat, every medal earned. I touched the fabric lightly, thinking of the soldiers who would stand straight and silent in the chapel, thinking of how Ted would have no idea until the moment arrived. Revenge stories do not always start with shouting. Sometimes they start with a chair, moved from the back table to the head. Sometimes they start with a printed protocol memo. Sometimes they start with the steady confidence that comes when you refuse to be erased that night. As I folded laundry and set out place cards for the reception, I felt something inside me shift. The hurt was still there. But so was the steel. They could laugh on Facebook. They could whisper in corners, but they would not be able to look away when the truth walked in. Polished leather shoes and saluted the house, settled. The refrigerator hummed. And somewhere on base, soldiers tightened belts and polished shoes, because when they showed up, they would not come as props. They would come as a wall of quiet respect, and Ted would finally learn that a costume is cloth without meaning, But a uniform is earned in the silence between orders and obedience, between courage and fear, between family betrayal and dignity regained, and soon he would see exactly which one I was wearing. The next turn came quietly, the way harm from a toxic family often arrives, not as a dramatic explosion, but as a steady drip that ruins the floorboards. It started in the family group chat, where the last of my patients used to live. I had posted the schedule for fittings at a bridal boutique downtown, a small place run by a veteran spouse who offered discount rates for military weddings. I chose it because she understood uniforms, medals, and the way fabric must respect posture. Within minutes, Ted replied with a message that did not read like a suggestion, but like an order. He wrote, "You need photos in a real dress to prove you can look normal." His tone slid across the screen like grease. My aunt chimed in with a laughing emoji and the comment, "It will be cute, like Halloween." Another cousin typed, "Come on, soldier girl, just one picture." I stared at the messages, feeling heat rise up the back of my neck. My mother added a softer version of the same pressure. "Just humor them, sweetheart." No need to fight, but humiliation was not neutral. It was a weapon, and they used it because they thought I still cared about their approval. I typed a calm reply that I would attend fittings in my ASU as scheduled, and no dress was needed. Ted replied with a long paragraph about family reputation and how he had promised the vendor we would represent ourselves properly in photos. He ended with the same line he always used when he wanted total control: be normal. Morgan. I closed the chat without answering because stubborn silence is a language they hated. At the boutique, the owner greeted me warmly. She adjusted the shoulders of my jacket, dusted lint from the sleeve, and stepped back with the kind of practiced pause of someone who had seen enough soldiers to know when a uniform carried real weight. The fitting room smelled of steamed fabric and lavender mannequins posed in white lace. While my ASU stood crisp and immovable in the mirror, the owner clipped the hem of my service coat, pinned a small adjustment, and said quietly, "You earned this. You do not need to prove anything." I smiled because she was right. The door chimed and a woman I recognized as my aunt swept in. She carried her phone high as if the world needed recording. She said, "Just one picture for the family album." I answered politely, "Not today. We are finalizing the uniform adjustment." She rolled her eyes and said, "The whole family thinks you are turning the wedding into a base ceremony." The owner froze, mid-pin, her expression unreadable. Then she resumed work with professional calm. After 10 minutes, my aunt left, unsatisfied that I had not cracked under the pressure. I paid my portion of the fitting fee at the counter and drove home thinking maybe this incident would be the end of it. But people who are intent on cruelty rarely stop after a single strike. 3 days later, the boutique owner called me, her voice apologetic. She said one of your family members called and said they were canceling the remaining balance on the service package. She sounded uncomfortable, like she hated being the messenger. I asked who canceled. She hesitated and then said the name Ted. She explained that the booking had been made under his name because he insisted on paying as a gift. But now he said the event no longer needed uniform work or protocol adjustments. My heart thudded once hard because this was not a misunderstanding. This was sabotage, quiet and petty. The worst kind. I thanked her for calling and told her to hold the contract until I figured it out. When I hung up, I sat still for a moment, listening to the refrigerator hum, and the clock tick in my family's sabotage always came disguised as concern. They would ruin something and then call it a lesson, a joke, a misunderstanding story. Financial became their favorite weapon. Money offered to control behavior, money withdrawn to punish resistance. I opened my laptop and pulled up the vendor contract. I called the boutique back and asked if we could move the contract into my name. She said yes, gladly. But Ted had already tried to move it to cancellation status. If she had not known I was active duty, she might have let it go. She paused, then said something that caught me by surprise. She said, "I see this kind of family betrayal. More often than you think, people mock what they cannot earn." I told her to transfer everything into my name, and I wired the full amount within the hour. She emailed me a receipt that read, "This account is now in the bride's name. No third party may alter arrangements." The line felt like a small shield, a quiet justice I built for myself. That night, the family group chat lit up. Ted typed, "We do not need the uniform adjustments I already canceled. Wear a dress like a normal woman." He added a picture of a lacy gown that looked nothing like me. Several relatives liked the message. I replied with a single sentence. "The contract is in my name now. Nothing is canceled." He sent a long, angry message about disrespect and ungratefulness. Elaine added her usual soft poison. "If you would just listen, this whole conflict would disappear." I closed the chat because they did not deserve my attention. I still had calls to make and tasks to finish. Respect was not something given. It was something held by force if necessary. The next morning at work, Captain Ruiz asked if everything was going smoothly with preparations. I laughed under my breath and told him family was being complicated. He said quietly, "Toxic family loves to make themselves the headline of someone else's happiness. Revenge, inheritance drama family was a real thing," I told him. I was not seeking revenge, only peace. He said sometimes dignity is revenge, and I thought about that for a long time. 2 days later, I visited the venue office. The event coordinator welcomed me with professional warmth. She showed me the layout again, aisle-length seating rows, timing for music cues, and then she lowered her voice and said, "Your stepfather called us. He said to remove any military elements. He said the family wanted a simple ceremony. We did not make changes because the contract lists you as primary." I thanked her and signed an updated note in the file, confirming that no changes could be made without my written consent. Then I emailed the chaplain attaching the memo and our AR 671 approval. His reply came fast. There will be no disruptions and no microphone access from guests considered handled. I sat in the empty venue hall for a few minutes and imagined the aisle filled with flowers and the soft scrape of chairs as people stood to salute, not because of drama, but because of respect earned on quiet days and dangerous nights. By the time I drove home, the sun had dipped low and the trees along the road glowed gold in the afternoon light. The phone buzzed with a new message from Ted. He accused me of humiliating him. He wrote, "If you think the Army loves you, they are just using you. Come back to normal life before you embarrass everyone." I had heard this speech before, the tone of a man who needed control more than love. I typed nothing back. Silence again. He kept writing words, growing nastier. My cousin even sent a picture of my ASU with pumpkin stickers photoshopped on it saying, "Look, Halloween came early." I stared at the image until the sting faded because they wanted a reaction and I would not give it. I moved the entire chat to archive and set my phone on silent. Sometimes the strongest revenge is attention they will never receive. Later that night, I opened the closet where my uniform hung. I straightened the ribbon rack, polished a small smudge from the brass, and felt steady again. The boutique had already emailed saying, "Your fittings are secure. See you next week. No one can cancel." I smiled because every quiet move was building pressure. They could not predict. They thought the wedding was their stage, but it was mine. And soon the moment would come when their power collapsed under its own weight. For now, I waited patient as stone, because money sabotage had failed, humiliation had failed, silence had become my strongest weapon, and the day of the ceremony was getting close enough to taste. The night after the boutique call, I drove to Cross Creek Mall to pick up a box of printed programs, the kind with cream paper and raised lettering that felt important beneath your fingers. The parking lot was half lit and half shadow autumn wind, carrying the smell of fried food from the food court and wet asphalt from an earlier drizzle. I parked beneath a flickering lamp and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly, thinking, maybe if I got through this errand, everything would feel lighter. My phone buzzed. I glanced down. It was my mother's name. I answered, and before I could speak, her voice rushed in, hot and trembling. She said, "Why do you insist on making everything so difficult?" She said, "Your stepfather is upset and the relatives are talking and you are embarrassing the family." She said the same old sentence that felt like a bruise that never healed. "Can you just be normal for once?" The words landed flat and cold in the dark car. I watched a couple walk by, holding hands and laughing. Two teenagers skated past on ripsticks. Normal everywhere except in the place I came from. Normal meant surrender. I told her quietly that the wedding was mine, not Ted's, not Colin's, not the cousins who mocked uniforms they would never earn. She sighed the way people sigh when they want to be the victim instead of the cause. She said, "You are pushing us away." I said, "No, you are pulling away because I will not obey." She fell silent, then said, "Just wear a simple dress and stop with the soldier act as if years of deployments and 14-hour shifts and casualty notifications were a costume." My chest tightened. My voice stayed steady. I said, "I have to go." She said, "Of course." Run away like usual, and she hung up first. I sat in the car with my phone glowing on my lap, the display dimming slowly as if it were falling asleep. I put it face down on the passenger seat and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. Somewhere a horn honked and laughter echoed from the food court doors. The night was ordinary while my life felt like a splinter under a fingernail, small but relentless. I finally got out and walked toward the print shop. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I picked up the box of programs. The clerk complimented the layout. I thanked him, smiled politely, walked back to the car, and told myself to breathe one step at a time, 1 hour at a time. When I got home, I showered and tried to sleep. The house was quiet. Ryan worked late shift and would not be home until morning. The darkness wrapped around me, but sleep would not come. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. Then again. A small, uncontrolled tremor of notifications. I reached for it and saw the family group chat flaring with messages. Colin had posted a meme of a soldier saluting in a clown wig, the uniform covered in cartoon stickers. The caption said, "When your sister thinks she is at a real war, but it is only her wedding beneath it." Laughing emojis from cousins, aunts, even one niece old enough to know better. The humiliation was not private anymore. It was public family. Betrayal spilled across screens. I felt something inside me go still, not broken, just still like a door closing softly. I did not reply. I scrolled slowly, reading every cruel comment twice, letting each word carve the line between us. Deeper, toxic family rarely hides their cruelty when they feel safe behind keyboards. Another meme appeared. This one with a pumpkin-headed bride in uniform. The caption said, "Halloween came early in Fayetteville." I could imagine them sitting on couches, laughing, feeling bold and clever, believing the humiliation would force me to bend, to give up the honor guard, to abandon the ASU, to perform correctness for people who had never respected me. Revenge. Emotional does not always burn hot. Sometimes it freezes, ice-cold clarity. I opened the gallery and saved every image, every message, every mocking line. I made a new folder and named it Receipts. Each screenshot slid into place with a quiet click evidence for later. Not for revenge, in rage, but for truth, in silence. The next day at battalion headquarters, I walked through the hallway with my shoulders straight and my chin level. The flag outside flapped in a cold breeze. The foyer smelled like coffee and floor polish. Soldiers nodded as I passed, respectful, steady, unaware of the storm roaring outside the walls of the uniform. I completed paperwork, reviewed training schedules, briefed 2 NCOs on transportation timelines, every action small but controlled. When my phone buzzed again, I ignored it. I had learned the power of silence. I turned off notifications entirely and tucked the phone into my desk drawer. It stayed there while the day passed in quiet efficiency. That evening, alone in the kitchen with the lights off except for the stove glow, I microwaved soup and stared at the dark window, my reflection faint in the glass. I whispered one word into the stillness. No, it was not loud, not dramatic, not cinematic. It was a sentence and a decision, a turning point so quiet it almost sounded like breath. No to humiliation, no to manipulation, no to performing worthiness for people who had never valued it. I did not need a showdown or a screamed argument. I only needed the small, solid truth that the next moves belonged to me. I opened my laptop and reviewed the ceremony plan, the seating chart, the timeline for the honor guard arrival, the protocol notes signed by Chaplain Carter. Everything was steady. Everything was locked. Nothing could be changed without my authorization. I added the date of the family messages to the receipts folder, not out of pettiness, but because documentation is power when words are twisted later, and they would twist them, they always did. Hours passed, and sleep still stayed far away. I made tea, paced the living room, straightened the stack of programs, read through the vows I had written, the words that came from the truest part of me, the part my family never saw. I thought about Ted and Colin and my mother, how they had shaped their own world, where my strength was a threat, and my independence an insult. Toxic family wants a version of you that is silent and soft and easy to blame. They wanted the girl who apologized for existing, not the woman who led soldiers. I sipped tea and felt the bitterness melt into calm. By the time dawn touched the windows, I had not slept, but I felt something stronger than rest, a clarity made of iron and breath. I got dressed, tied my hair, clipped my name tape to my uniform, and looked into the mirror. My reflection stood steady, not shaken, not desperate for approval, just ready. Breaking point had passed quietly in the night. It had not come with tears or shouting. It had come with screenshots, silence, and one small word spoken into the dark. No, and beneath that, no was the deeper truth. You cannot move me. You cannot erase me. The wedding would come. The uniforms would shine. The honor guard would stand in perfect formation, and my family would watch without knowing that the moment of their undoing had already begun. The morning of the wedding arrived with a pale mist clinging to the grass along the parade field and the quiet kind of cold that smelled like metal and pine. I woke before the alarm sat up in the stillness and listened to the house breathe. Ryan already gone to the chapel to help the coordinator, my ASU hanging on the closet door like a promise sharpened to a blade. I showered, braided my hair with steady hands, and fastened each ribbon in a straight line that felt like a sentence written in discipline outside the car. Headlights cut through the fog as I drove toward Main Post Chapel. The sky washed in gray, the base slowly waking soldiers jogging the track, cadence echoing soft and rhythmic in the distance. When I reached the chapel, the honor guard NCOIC stood at the side entrance with a clipboard, his voice low but firm as he took roll. Each name answered with a crisp, here boots aligned in neat rows, white gloves tucked sharp and clean. They nodded when they saw me. Not exaggerated, just respect that unspoken language of acknowledgement inside the chapel. The windows glowed with muted morning light. The pews, polished floral arrangements set precisely on either side of the aisle. Everything calm. Everything controlled. I met the chaplain near the front where he reviewed the run of show. He confirmed the invocation, confirmed the timing. Cues confirmed that no microphone would pass to guests, his voice steady as stone. I thanked him, and he said quietly, "You have earned a ceremony without chaos. Let the noise end at the door." The first sergeant arrived, next checked his watch, accepted the time hack, then stepped outside to coordinate with color guard, every piece moving with silent precision, conflict, justice stitched into every detail. Revenge. Stories do not always need shouting. Sometimes they are built with paperwork signatures and quiet intent. By mid-morning, the sky brightened, the fog thinning into blue family, and guests began to arrive in clusters, cars filling the lot, heels tapping the walkway, perfume mixing with the crisp air. I stood near the vestibule, greeting a few friends while maintaining distance from the relatives whose voices floated sharp and judgmental across the entryway. I heard Ted before I saw him, his words carrying that smug confidence of a man who believed he still controlled the room. He said, "If she starts her little march, I will take the mic and set things straight." I paused, my fingers resting lightly on the brim of my cap, his voice rising with false authority, saying, a wedding is not a military parade, and he would not allow everyone to be humiliated again. I listened without turning silent, then walked deeper into the chapel to check the seating. The coordinator approached quietly and slipped me a note confirming the DJ setup. The note said, Guest microphones are disabled. No open channel. Only pre-approved speakers lived. The small satisfaction warmed my chest. Mini revenge felt like air expanding in my lungs. Earlier that week, I had emailed the chaplain and venue a formal run of show signed by command and ceremony officer. The agreement stated clearly that only efficient bride and groom had microphone access. No exceptions. The DJ had programmed a hard mute function that could shut down any unauthorized device. Ted could walk to the microphone if he wanted, but he would find silence waiting for him. Guests filled the pews, murmuring politely, the air thick with anticipation. I stood in a side room with the stained glass casting red and gold patches across the floor. My mother peeked in. Makeup, neat expression, pulled tight like a mask. She whispered, "You could still change your mind. Ted just wants dignity for the family." She wore a tone that sounded like peace but tasted like pressure. I replied calmly, "This wedding has dignity. Respect is not costume jewelry that comes and goes with their mood." She frowned and said, "You always make things dramatic," then left before I could answer. Once the door closed, the silence felt like relief. The bouquet sat on a small table, white roses wrapped in cloth that matched the trim of my jacket. I lifted it, breathed in the soft floral scent, and felt my heartbeat slow to a measured pace. Outside the chime of the chapel, bells sounded once, twice, 3 times signaling the ceremony would begin soon. The coordinator knocked gently and said, "They are ready for you." I nodded and stepped into the hallway. The honor guard waiting at the entry with rifles polished to mirror, shined their uniform shoes reflecting the marble floor. The NCOIC gave a small nod and said, "Command is set. When you give the signal, we proceed." I thanked him, not loudly, not dramatically, just with that controlled tone that lives in my bones. In the front row, Ted sat with his chest puffed and shoulders arrogant, whispering to Elaine, pointing toward the honor guard. With obvious annoyance, the first strains of music began soft and dignified, rippling through the chapel. I stood tall as the doors opened. The guests rose and light from the stained glass spilled across the aisle like a river of color. Step by step, I walked slow, deliberate, a measured pace I had learned on parade fields under hotter suns and harsher skies. Ted leaned toward the aisle. I could see his jaw tighten, see his hand clutch the armrest. I reached the front where Ryan waited. Eyes warm and steady, the chaplain began speaking. His voice filling the chapel with reverence, everything unfolding exactly as planned. Then I saw movement. Ted rose from his seat, tugged his jacket, and started walking toward the microphone stand. At the front left, his face, red mouth twisted in determination. Elaine reached for him, but he shrugged her off. He reached the microphone, tapped the top as if testing for sound, then opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tapped again. Harder. No sound, just silence. The DJ looked up, briefly pressed one button without expression, maintaining the mute. Ted turned to the audience, gesturing wildly for attention, his lips moving in angry shapes, but the chapel stayed quiet. People stared, confusion turning to discomfort. I watched him not with triumph, but with that calm clarity that comes when a storm finally breaks without touching you. He tried again, waving his hands, pointing at the honor guard, mouthing the word ridiculous, but the silence swallowed every ounce of his performance. At last he stomped back to his seat, cheeks flushed, muttering beneath his breath. The ceremony continued, a small tremor of humiliation rippling through the first rows, conflict, justice settling in like dust on his shoulders. This quiet failure burned deeper than any argument could have. The chaplain resumed his reading, steady and unshaken. The vows unfolded with solemn weight. Ryan's voice steady, my own voice steady, every word, a vow not just to him but to myself, to never again shrink for people who sharpen their love into weapons. When the ceremony ended, the coordinator guided guests toward the reception. The honor guard moved into position for the next phase, but Ted lingered near the front, glaring at the DJ table, as if he could will sound into existence. He tried to confront the coordinator, pointing toward the equipment, but she only showed him the signed run of show, his name nowhere near it, his authority reduced to nothing by a single sheet of paper. I watched from a distance, bouquet in hand, the image of him, deflating slowly like a balloon losing air, and I realized this was the beginning of the unraveling. Not the end. The plan was locked, the pieces in motion, and the public exposure would be far louder than any microphone he never got to touch. Revenge stories do not need screaming villains. Sometimes the villain whispers into a dead microphone while the world watches in silence, and sometimes silence is the loudest justice of all. The hour turned 4:10 p.m., and the light inside the chapel changed from soft gold to a sharper blaze. Through the stained glass, every beam catching on brass buttons and polished shoes, the guests shifting quietly in their rows as the chaplain closed his book and stepped back, a hush, falling so still that I could hear my own pulse. Then Ted, who had been stewing for almost the entire ceremony, leaned forward in the first pew, his voice rising, not a whisper, not a mutter, but loud enough to carry through the stone arches and wooden beams. He said, "This is ridiculous," stretching the word like an insult. A few relatives tensed, as if waiting for more commentary, his hand already on his phone, ready to record what he believed would be my humiliation. And in that moment, the first sergeant near the front, who had been watching the timing with the focus of a man trained to move at exact seconds, lifted his chin, stepped into the aisle, and his voice cracked like a command pulled from a parade field. "Brigade attention." The sound ricocheted off the walls. Boots hit the floor as nearly 150 soldiers and officers rose, as a single body back, straight eyes forward, heels clicking like thunder, rolling through the pews. The civilians gasped, some half standing in confusion, some gripping the seat in front of them, the discipline of those uniforms swallowing the room in perfect order. Before anyone could breathe, the first sergeant drew breath again and gave the order that broke the moment wide open. Present arms, the movement snapped together, rifles lifted in perfect unison, right hands raised in crisp salute toward me and toward the flag, a wave of respect rolling through the chapel so strong it changed the air itself. The silence exploded into reverence, and somewhere behind me, a woman began to cry softly, because the moment was that heavy, that sacred, and it was clear to everyone that the uniform Ted called a costume was the armor of someone who had carried lives and responsibility in places he would never stand. The honor guard stepped through the center aisle. Next, rifles, gleaming flags unfurled each step, measured with ceremonial gravity. The stained glass poured red and gold on their shoulders, turning the scene into something almost unreal, like history, folding itself over the moment. I stood still, not trembling, not smiling, simply letting it happen, letting the truth speak louder than any argument ever could conflict. Justice delivered not in words, but in silence and steel. The chaplain stepped aside, allowing the color guard to take position, and an aide approached the lectern with a small folder in his hands, his voice calm as he read a brief citation, listing rank assignments, deployments, commendations, and medals, concise but undeniable, each sentence adding weight, each detail slicing away the lies and mockery Ted had thrown like stones. The civilians who had risen hesitantly before now stood taller, some placing their hands over their hearts, others smoothing their jackets as if suddenly aware they were in the presence of something formal and rare. A hush settled so deep it felt like time stopped. I looked toward my family's pew. Elaine's hand trembled against her purse. Her lips parted, but no words came. Colin stared wide-eyed as if seeing me for the first time in his life, his arrogance peeled back layer by layer under the sheer force of military respect unfolding around him, and Ted, once loud and smug, had gone pale. His phone halfway raised thumb, poised to record, but the movement caught the eye of the chapel security, who approached with the polite firmness of professionals used to dealing with entitled guests. "Sir, may I ask you to put the phone away? This is a restricted ceremony and recording is not permitted." Ted sputtered, tried to argue, but the guard did not step back, did not soften, simply waited, hand near the folded program at his waist, and Ted, suddenly aware of every eye near him, lowered the phone and slid it into his jacket with a shaking hand. The aide closed the folder, and the first sergeant held his salute a beat longer before giving the command for the honor guard to recover. Flags dipped, rifles lowered in perfect control, every movement smooth, not theatrical, just disciplined. This was not a show. It was respect earned in silence and service. Revenge stories sometimes roar, but sometimes they speak quietly in the language of protocol. The guests sank back into their pews, slowly like people coming back to themselves. After a great storm, the chaplain stepped forward again, his voice gentle but steady as he continued the final blessing. And I felt something shift inside my chest, a knot, untying a weight, lifting the years of being dismissed, shrinking under the undeniable reality that stood around me. As the ceremony moved toward its final moments, whispers rippled through the crowd, not mocking whispers, but reverent ones. I heard someone say, "I had no idea," another say, "She earned every inch of those ribbons." Someone in the third row sighed and murmured that Ted should be ashamed, though they did not know his name, they knew his type. The color guard began the slow march toward the exit booths, against stone echoing deep and rhythmic. The sun painting streaks of color across their passing silhouettes, the air filled with that solemn pride that clings to military ceremonies, the kind of pride that needs no applause. The chaplain invited us to face the aisle, and Ryan and I began the recessional arm in arm each step, steady the soldiers at attention, lining the walkway salutes, held until the last possible moment the civilians parted silently. As if afraid to disrupt the ceremony, my family stayed seated, trapped in a silence they had never expected to taste their reputations undone without anyone raising a voice, without a single insult thrown back. Revenge, emotional, rooted itself right there, justice through truth and dignity, instead of shouting. Outside the chapel, the honor guard formed a saber arch, sunlight flashing along the blades, the air cool and electric as we walked beneath it. The soldiers called out our names with respect, their voices ringing clean. The photographers captured every second shots, framed by flags and gleaming steel. The guests cheered politely, now no longer confused, now understanding that this was not a base spectacle, not a parade for pride, but ceremony for honor, and the only ones who looked out of place were the people who had tried to make me small. When the crowd dispersed toward the reception hall, Ted tried to stand, but his knees shook. One of the aunts reached for his arm, but he pulled away, face, red eyes glassy with embarrassment that went bone deep. He muttered that the whole thing was unnecessary, but no one nodded, no one agreed. Even Elaine stayed silent, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor as if she could rewind time. Colin whispered something to her, but she did not answer, and when I walked past them, I did not stop, did not ask for approval. My silence was heavier than any speech. The soldiers dismissed in formation, moving across the courtyard with precision, their boots striking pavement like punctuation marks in the story. Fate had written, the guests followed, buzzing now with excitement and awe. People asking Ryan about missions, people asking me about deployments, civilians adjusting their jackets and smoothing their skirts, as if trying to match the dignity of the uniforms they had just seen. And for the first time in a long time, I felt fully seen, not because of a title or a microphone, but because respect had been earned in places my family never cared to look. This was the public exposure moment, the outline promised, the instant when the balance of power flipped without force, without a scream, and all Ted could do was sit in the chapel. His pride shattered his control, gone and his voice silenced, not by cruelty but by protocol and truth. The reception at the Iron Mike Conference Center felt like stepping into another world, one where the air no longer carried tension or whispered mockery, but steady admiration that moved through the crowd like a tide. The chandeliers throwing warm light across glass silver and polished floors, and the walls lined with portraits of generals whose stern faces watched over the room as if acknowledging that today belonged to someone who had earned her place. I walked in with Ryan beside me, fingers interlaced bouquet tucked in the crook of my arm, and the moment we crossed the threshold, the first guests rose from their seats, then more, until a wave of uniformed officers and seasoned NCOs formed a neat line that stretched across the carpet, waiting not with forced smiles, but with genuine respect. One by one, they shook my hand, thanking me for decisions made in hours when danger sat too close, reminding me of medevac calls answered in the dark, of logistics missions pulled off at the last minute of making the call in the 59th minute, when hesitation could have taken lives. Their words soft but anchored with sincerity, and the civilians around them watched with wide eyes, hearing pieces of a world they had never touched, a world that demanded discipline, not costumes, sacrifice, not pretense. The gratitude settled into my shoulders like a blanket of honor, not heavy, but warm. As the receiving line continued, the band began to play. Low jazz glasses clinked, waitstaff moved gracefully between tables, and the coordinator signaled to the AV technician, lights dimming slightly, as the projector hummed to life. The screen on the far wall brightened, showing the first of a curated slideshow. Not personal photos, but unit commendations, group shots after completed missions, official citations, soldiers in formation under blazing heat, medics kneeling beside stretchers, helicopters kicking dust into a spinning cloud under desert sun. The audience grew quiet, row by row, turning toward the display. Then the next slide appeared. A command team shot with me at the center. Ribbons, bright eyes, tired but steady, and a soft ripple of surprise spread through the room. Civilians whispering she was there, officers nodding with knowing looks, and someone near the back let out a breath that sounded like awe. Each picture, not a brag, not a performance, but evidence of service that no insult from Ted or Colin could shrink family betrayal, felt distant now, as if the weight of their pettiness had evaporated in the presence of truth. At the table reserved for my family, 5 chairs sat stiff and uncomfortable. Elaine's posture, rigid hands crossed tight as if trying to hold her composure together. Colin scrolling his phone with nervous energy, and Ted slumped back, cheeks flushed with humiliation he was still trying to swallow. No one approached them for conversation. No one asked for photos while the rest of the room buzzed toward me and Ryan like gravity had shifted, betrayal, family, karma, playing out. Not with shouting, but with isolation, a slow social unraveling that left them exposed without a single cruel word spoken. The coordinator, still following protocol after Ted's behavior at the chapel, approached their table politely with a clipboard and explained that per venue etiquette and house rules, guests who disrupt ceremony or attempt unauthorized speeches are seated away from the head tables to ensure the comfort of others. Her tone was gentle but unmovable, and she gestured toward a quieter corner near the side wall, offering to help them move their plates. The family froze, too proud to stand, too embarrassed to refuse, and the message sank in like a stone dropped into deep water. They were no longer the center of anything. Security hovered discreetly near them, not threatening, just present, making sure there were no more attempts to cause chaos, while I moved through the room, shaking hands and accepting congratulations that felt real and deserved. A colonel with silver hair leaned forward and told me I had held the line when supplies ran thin overseas, that leadership like mine was rare. And as he spoke, I caught sight of 2 civilian women at the next table, leaning toward each other, whispering, "She is the bride, the officer in the photos." I thought it was just a uniform for show. Another woman added softly, "Her father must feel foolish now," and I did not turn. did not acknowledge. I just took a sip of sparkling water and let the truth do its work. Revenge stories sometimes unfold as whispers in a banquet hall, as realization dawning across faces, as respect shifting to the person who deserved it and away from the ones who tried to take it. The band transitioned into something brighter. Guests moved onto the dance floor, laughter rising like relief, and Ryan spun me gently, his hands solid and warm, his voice low as he said, "See, they see you now." I answered quietly. They always saw the surface. The uniform did not make me, the work did, and he nodded because he understood later, when the cake was brought out and applause filled the room. Ted tried once more to reclaim dignity, standing abruptly as if he might give a toast, but the coordinator was faster, stepping in with a smile and a reminder that all speakers were pre-approved. She guided him back to his seat without raising her voice, and the room pretended not to see everyone choosing not to feed his power that was the real social gravity, watching a man who had always dominated family rooms find himself irrelevant. The projector looped through images again this time, showing a brief clip of our deployment return soldiers disembarking a transport plane, boots hitting the tarmac families, cheering beyond the fences, and one table full of guests stood spontaneously applauding others, joined the sound swelling loud and fierce, and for a moment I felt tears prick my eyes. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming contrast, the world where responsibility mattered, where service meant something, compared to the small world Ted tried to trap me in, a world of control and belittling, now collapsing in silence behind him. As the evening moved on, the guests seemed to orbit farther from my family's corner, leaving them in a circle of empty chairs and untouched food. Elaine's eyes shiny, as if she understood finally that the cruelty they had delivered came back with interest. Betrayal, family karma, arriving not as dramatic punishment, but as quiet abandonment. And when Ryan and I made our way to the head table, people lifting glasses for a toast, I saw Ted resting his forehead in his hand. No smirk left his authority dissolved, and for the first time, he looked like someone who realized he no longer had an audience. The night ended with music and gentle goodbyes, the soldiers clapping me on the back, promising to stop by later, the officers offering advice for the next step in my career, the civilians thanking me for service. They now understood was not a costume. Outside, the air was cool stars, sharp above Fort Liberty, and the last image I saw before leaving was my family gathering their things, slowly, not speaking to anyone, not approached by anyone. A quiet stretch of space forming around them, like truth, had pushed the whole world one step away. That was the brake run, the fallout, and it felt cleaner than anger, cleaner than shouting. It was justice delivered in silence, shaped by respect, and carved by the weight of the life I had lived. A week after the reception, I sat at Uptown's Coffee, a quiet shop near Hay Street, where the windows caught the late October sun and the smell of roasted beans settled low and warm in the air. I was reading a report on logistics allocations for winter training when the bell over the door chimed, and without looking up, I somehow already knew it was Ted. There was a certain heaviness in his footsteps now, not confidence, but hesitation. He paused near my table, as if waiting for an invitation, yet none came, so he sat anyway, clearing his throat with that familiar performative sound he always used when he wanted the room to know he was important. I closed the folder and met his eyes without smiling. The silence held steady. Not cold, just precise. He shifted in his chair before trying for a soft tone. "Morgan, I came to talk about something practical," his voice reaching for calm but snagging on nerves. I took a slow sip of coffee waiting, and he finally said what he actually came for. "Colin is looking at opportunities on base. There is a civilian contractor position opening, something with supply or planning. It would mean a lot to him if you could make a recommendation." The words dropped onto the table like stones, and for a moment, I simply watched him. The man who had mocked my uniform humiliated me. In front of family, tried to sabotage my ceremony, now asking for access to a world he called a costume. He misread my silence as hesitation born from emotion rather than boundaries, so he pushed further. You know how these things work. A good word from you would go a long way. I kept my voice even as I asked why he would think I owed Colin anything. Ted bristled, eyes narrowing before he forced a laugh. Families help each other, he said, like we always have. I felt the absurdity of those words settle in the air. Family helping family when all they had done was tear at me piece by piece. Conflict justice taking shape in the quiet between us. I told him calmly that I did not use my uniform to pull strings, not for myself and not for anyone else. But Ted leaned forward, lowering his voice, saying, "Come on, I already told a few people you would vouch. It will look awkward if you do not follow through." That was the escalated twist. He had gone ahead and used my name, banking on leverage. He thought he still had his mouth kept moving. Bragging that he had spoken to an acquaintance at the contractor office, hinted that his daughter in the army would grease the wheels. And when he said those words, I watched realization dawn too late in his eyes. He had confessed to using my service, using my reputation to carve a path he had no right to walk. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch just long enough that he had to sit in it. Ted shifted again, trying to soften his voice, saying, "You owe Colin after the wedding mess. Everyone was stressed. It was not personal. You know how these things get blown out of proportion? That sentence hung there like an insult wrapped in apology, revenge. Emotional flickering through my chest, not rage but clarity. I told him he had mistaken silence for weakness, mistaken forgiveness for obligation, mistaken blood for entitlement. And for the first time in my life, I watched him actually hear me, his posture, shrinking, his jaw unclenching, his voice faltering. He asked if I would just think about it, maybe reach out to someone just to be kind. And that was when I placed a small folder on the table between us. Not dramatic, not loud, just deliberate. Inside were printed screenshots of his Facebook post mocking the ceremony the meme Colin sent in the family group chat, the text where he called the honor guard, embarrassing the note he wrote saying, "I would ruin the family name if I wore the uniform." His hand froze midway between table and coffee cup color, draining from his face. I spoke quietly, not angry, just steady. I told him I did not need these for revenge. I did not plan to humiliate him further, but I would not allow him to use my service as a tool for his gain if he wanted help. There would be terms, real terms. Not empty apologies whispered behind closed doors. I laid them out calmly. First, a written apology addressed to the entire family group chat and any friends he had forwarded those mocking messages to. Second, 12 months of silence. No insults, no passive comments, no interference in my marriage or my career. Third, he would not speak of having a daughter in the army to gain social standing or professional favors. And fourth, he would not contact anyone on base, contractor, or soldier using my name. If he broke any condition, I would send the receipts folder to the appropriate channels, including the contracting office. He stared at me as if I had just spoken a language he did not understand, mouth opening and closing with no words forming. Then the anger surged, cheeks, red eyes sharp. He sputtered that families do not make contracts, that I was overreacting, that I was acting superior. He hissed, that everyone gets help. Sometimes I answered that everyone earns help, not demands it. And the line broke something in him. He shoved back from the table chair, scraping harshly across the floor, earning glances from nearby customers, but he did not notice he stood blinking. Breath-short pride, shredding under the weight of consequences he had never experienced. He tried one last time to force control back into his voice, saying, "Fine, you want to pretend you are better than us, do it, but do not come crawling back later." I remained seated calm and told him I had never crawled, not once, and I would not start now. Ted grabbed his coat, knocking over the small container of sugar packets, but made no move to clean it up. He stormed to the door, nearly missing the handle in his rush, then disappeared into the bright afternoon shoulders, hunched steps uneven. I did not watch him go. I simply picked up my coffee again, opened my folder, and continued reading the training report. Not triumphant, just settled. The barista walked past and offered more cream, unaware of the small war that had just ended without a single raised voice, the quiet kind of victory that leaves no broken glass, only boundaries drawn in permanent ink. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed a message from the contracting coordinator confirming that any inquiries using my name would be flagged and reported. I replied with a simple thank you, then closed my notebook, the sunlight falling across my hand, warm and steady, and I realized that I did not feel vindictive. I felt free. Revenge stories do not always end with someone punished publicly. Sometimes they end with a door closing firmly on entitlement, with a woman choosing herself over family patterns that once owned her. Ted left with nothing. No favor, no apology received, no ground gained, and I left with everything I needed. Dignity intact, boundaries unshaken, and silence no longer requested, but required. He had asked, and the answer was no. Not loudly, not cruelly, just final. 3 days after the meeting at Uptown's Coffee, I woke to the soft vibration of my phone on the nightstand, the screen glowing in the dim morning light, an email notification flashing across the top. At first, I planned to ignore T and let the day begin quietly, but something in the subject line pulled at my attention. It read, "Application Status Update." The sender was a private contracting company known for bringing on civilian planners with military-adjacent access, the kind of job Colin had been chasing. I opened it slowly, eyes moving across each sentence, and then I read the line that settled like a stone in my chest. After reviewing your materials, we have elected not to proceed due to misrepresentation of military references and unauthorized name-dropping of personnel. The words were simple, but unmistakable. They had caught him not because of me, but because Ted could not resist bragging. He had walked into a world ruled by documentation and regulation and tried to bluff his way through with ego and family myths, betrayal, family karma, returning with silent precision. Before I could even process it, my phone buzzed again this time, a call Colin's name lighting up the screen. I let it ring, then ring again. The voicemail tone beeped, and after a long exhale, Colin's voice filled the room, shaky and angry. He said, "I do not know what you told them, but they said, I lied about you. That I claimed I had pull on base. That I promised you would vouch. This is ruining my chances. Call me back." His voice cracked at the end. Half fury, half panic, I put the phone down without replying, because the truth was I had not said a word to the contractor. They had uncovered the lie themselves. This was not my revenge. This was cause and effect. Later that afternoon, another message arrived, this time from a cousin who rarely contacted me at all. She wrote that she had taken down an old Facebook post, a sarcastic comment she made on Ted's status during the dress rehearsal night. She apologized, saying she did not realize how deep the disrespect had gone until she saw the ceremony photos and heard what people were saying. Afterward, she admitted that the mocking posts were circulating through the extended family, and that instead of making me look foolish, they made Ted look cruel, and her message ended with a line that felt like truth, settling into place. "We were wrong about you, and people are embarrassed. The apology was private, not loud or public, but it was more than I ever expected. Revenge, emotional, sometimes emerges in confessions, whispered through screens, small acknowledgments that the power dynamic has shifted." That evening, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother, her voice soft, weighed down with hesitation. She asked if we could have dinner, just the two of us. Her words careful, as if stepping across thin ice. I knew Ted was nearby because I heard his voice in the background asking who she was calling. She quickly said wrong number and hung up, then texted me separately to confirm a time. I stared at the message for a long moment, then wrote, "I will come, but without him." And she agreed instantly. No excuses, no deflection, just yes, just The next day, I drove to her house, parking in the short driveway where I had spent so many childhood afternoons riding bikes and climbing trees. Now it felt smaller, like a stage where the old version of me used to stand. I walked up the path and saw her through the screen door, hands wringing, eyes glossy with exhaustion. She opened the door and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than expected. Her voice cracked when she said, "Thank you for coming." We sat at the kitchen table where she had set 2 plates but barely touched the food. She kept apologizing in quiet sentences that trembled at the edges. She said she never realized how isolating it must have felt to sit at dinners where no one listened, how painful it must have been when they laughed at my service. She said she did not know how to stop them, so she pretended not to see, which was its own kind of betrayal. I listened without interrupting, then reached into my bag and slid a small folded paper across the table. She opened it slowly, her eyes moving across the lines. Written in my handwriting, the words, clear and unembellished, "I love you, but respect is the condition I will not accept insults, pressure to be normal, or silence. When I am mocked, I will not attend any gathering. Ted controls, and I will not be the family's target anymore. I want a relationship, but only if it is healthy." She read it twice, hands trembling around the edges. Tears finally slipping free, she nodded and said, "I understand it will be just us for a while, and I will not ask you to bend anymore." That was the mini revenge softened into boundaries. Not punishment, just clarity. A few days later, Colin sent another voicemail this time. His tone was different, not angry, but defeated. He said the contractor had flagged his file and that the rejection had reached his current employer. They had asked questions he could not answer the lie, spreading farther than he expected. He said Ted was blaming me, saying I set him up. But Colin admitted that deep down, he knew the truth. He and Ted were the ones who inflated their importance, not me. He ended with a short line. I do not know how to fix this, and for the first time I felt something like closure, not satisfaction, but release, a reminder that actions build their own consequences without needing my hands to push. Social media shifts slowly but steadily, and over the next week the mocking posts vanished one by one, deleted quietly, ashamed of themselves. People who once rolled their eyes at my career now commented carefully on wedding photos, posted by friends, writing congratulations, writing thank you for your service, writing I did not know. And while it did not erase the years of dismissal, it painted a new reality where truth stood clearer than rumor. My mother sent a short message every morning, not heavy, not emotional, just checking in, asking about my day, about training, about whether Ryan and I were settling into our new place. She never brought up. Ted never asked me to forgive him, and the silence there was its own apology. She and I began meeting for coffee once a week, her smile softer, her shoulders less tight, as if she had finally allowed herself to let go of the family script Ted always enforced. One evening, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photo from the reception, the one where the soldiers stood in salute inside the chapel, stained glass, casting color across the marble. She said, "I want this in my house where people can see who you are, not who Ted wanted you to be," her voice, steady, her pride sincere, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something like peace settle in my chest. There was no dramatic collapse for Ted, no explosive confrontation, no scene that would make strangers gasp. Instead, he faded, his voice quieter at family events, his opinions carrying no weight, people no longer humoring his arrogance. The man who weaponized reputation now found his own reputation too fragile to stand on betrayal. Family karma had run its course not through vengeance, but through exposure, truth rearranging the hierarchy he once controlled. In the end, the fallout did not break the family. It simply reshaped it. Lines drawn where chaos used to live. Respect seated where mockery once sat. And when I looked at my mother across those small cafe tables, I realized that this was the justice I wanted. Not revenge that burned the house down, but a boundary that rebuilt it without the rot. The world had turned gently but decisively, and the people who once tried to make me feel small now sat in the quiet made by their own choices, while I walked forward without apology. Shoulders straight uniform earned life, built on truth rather than permission. December settled over Fort Liberty with a soft cold that smelled like wood smoke and pine, the sky silver in the early morning, the kind of winter light that makes the world look clean and quiet. I laced my running shoes and stepped onto the Cape Fear River Trail. Breath turning white in the chilled air, the path stretched ahead, like a ribbon through bare trees, leaves crunching underfoot the river, moving slow and dark beside me. Ryan jogged a few paces behind, giving me space to think. The silence here felt different. Not the heavy silence of holding back words, but the peaceful kind that comes after storms have passed and the ground has finally dried. I thought about the wedding, the chapel, the salute, the reception hall, and the way the world rearranged itself without me having to scream, just by standing steady in who I was. Conflict justice, delivered in discipline and dignity instead of cruelty. By the time we looped back toward Haymount, sunlight had climbed through the trees, warming the frost on the grass. We walked the last stretch, hand in hand, the quiet kind of happiness. No audience, no stage, no family judgment hanging over us, just two people living a life built on respect. When we reached the house, a package rested on the front porch, small, wrapped in plain brown paper. No return address inside was an envelope hand-addressed in neat military script. I recognized the handwriting before I even opened it. The first sergeant had sent a short letter written on crisp stationery. "Ma'am, you led without noise." That was the whole message. No long speech, no dramatic praise, just 8 words that carried more weight than any apology Ted could ever give. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the mantel next to a framed photograph from the chapel the moment the soldiers raised their hands in present arms, stained glass, pouring red gold light across marble. My uniform bright against the dark suits, that picture felt like a doorway, a reminder of a life I earned when no one was watching. In the days that followed, I settled back into training schedules, logistics meetings, early mornings and cold air evenings with coffee and after-action reports. The world felt steady again. My phone buzzed sometimes with messages from soldiers checking in, one of them joking that my wedding ceremony had better turnout than his last change of command. Civilians at the commissary nodded politely, sometimes offering a quiet thank you. Not loud, not forced, just sincere. And I accepted each gesture with a small smile, because truth does not need volume. One afternoon in mid-December, with the house warm and cinnamon-scented from the cookies Ryan was baking, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I knew by heart. Holiday dinner next week. We thought everyone could come together. Ted had written it as if nothing had happened, as if the world had reset, as if he could script a return to normal without acknowledging the harm he caused. I stared at the message for a long moment, the room silent except for the faint hum of the oven. Then I opened my files, scrolled to the document labeled Terms, and attached it to my reply. I wrote, "When you sign this, I will consider attending," and sent the message without hesitation, a polite period, at the end. Instead of anger, his reply came almost instantly, a burst of irritation that tried to mask itself as sarcasm. "You are really going to make this official? You are really going to put conditions on family?" I read it once, then set the phone down and went back to helping Ryan shape dough into perfect circles. I did not reply, and the silence itself became the answer. Days passed. Christmas lights glowing on porches, wreaths hanging from doors, and once again my phone lit up. Ted asking, "Are you coming or not?" I answered with the same line, "When you sign, I will consider it." He stopped texting, and something about that felt like a door, closing softly. Not slammed, just latched, firmly and peacefully. The next week, my mother called, her voice hopeful, but not pleading. She said she and I could have lunch the day after Christmas. Just us. She did not ask me to forgive Ted or to bend. She simply offered time and space, and I accepted because boundaries did not erase love, they protected it. One night, Ryan and I sat by the fireplace wrapped in blankets drinking hot chocolate while the picture from the chapel glowed in the light of the flames, the soldiers frozen in salute, the moment suspended forever behind glass. I touched the frame lightly and said, "I did not raise my voice. I raised the standard." Ryan smiled quietly and said that was the difference. That was why the world shifted, not because I yelled loud enough to be heard, but because I stood tall enough to be seen. As the year neared its end, I realized something had changed inside me, not just with Ted or Colin or even my mother, but with myself. The small part that once waited for approval had finally gone silent, replaced by something steadier, quieter, stronger. Not anger, but confidence. Anger burns fast and hot, confidence endures. I no longer needed the family dinners or the forced laughter or the empty praise. I had built a life where respect came from action, not blood. On the last morning of December, I walked the Cape Fear River Trail, again frost cracking under my shoes, the river shining in pale silver light, birds cutting across the sky in slow arcs. I breathed deep, letting the cold air curl in my lungs, and felt a calm that was not fragile, but firm. I understood that poetic justice is not always loud or cinematic. Sometimes it is a man sitting alone at a dinner. He planned wondering why no one showed up. Sometimes it is a contractor rejecting an application built on lies. Sometimes it is a daughter saying no without raising her voice. Sometimes it is a wedding photograph hanging on the wall where people cannot ignore what was earned. When the sun lifted over the trail, I turned back toward home, stepping through the front door where the smell of coffee greeted me. Ryan handed me a mug and kissed my forehead. I looked again at the framed photo of present arms and the letter from the first sergeant, both symbols of a truth. Ted could never change the truth that respect is not inherited. It is earned, that family does not get unconditional access to the life you bled for, that betrayal cannot erase what duty has built. If you read this and felt something stir in your chest, if you have ever held your head high while the world tried to make you smaller, if you have walked away from toxic family and chosen yourself, then share a line below your story of silent revenge and emotional resilience might give someone else dignity over money. Truth and closure, a reminder that standing up for yourself is not cruelty. It is reclaiming respect. There is a lesson in betrayal without hate, justice without hate, revenge through truth. Quiet justice always speaks loudest when you do not need to shout at all.